I like to talk about selling, but not everyone takes the selling. They prefer to just do what they're asked to do. So here's a question for you. Can you take these doers and turn them into sellers? Settle in for a pocket sized pep talk because my guest today says he knows how.
A Pocket Sized Pep Talk, the podcast that can help energize your business and your life with a quick, inspiring message. Now, here's your host, Rob Jollis.
My guest, Sean Cambell, has been training, mentoring, and educating all his life. It says here Sean is an exceptionally well-regarded conference speaker. I'll be the judge of that. And author, and has delivered talks to Fortune 50 companies and top-tier conferences. Sean has also authored several books, and he's been a professional services firm owner for over 20 years. Welcome to the show, Sean.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Right off the bat, when I was starting to research you, you used the term professional services firm. So I know the definition of a professional services firm. I'm not sure all the people listening today know it. So real quick, give us a definition because we're going to be probably bumping into that term a few times.
Sure. I mean, the most obvious example would be your lawyers, your accountants, those kinds of folks. But the next step down is basically anybody that the primary thing they're doing for you is kind of personal labor of a sort. So you could carry that all the way down to like lawn mowing services, right? You don't really care what lawnmower they use. You care how they service your lawn, right? So even contractors like painting and concrete and all the rest of that kind of stuff, you could even get down to that, are all professional services of a form. And the real main distinction, I think, is that the quality of what you're getting is driven by the people performing the service more than the object you're receiving. And that's the distinction, basically, at the end of the day. And so, I don't know the exact stat, but from what I read, I remember a while back, is there's actually way more service firms in the US than there are product firms, because it's also an easy business to get into. Conversely, at times it can be a hard business to scale. And one of the reasons it can be hard is actually how you build out your sales team.
And there we go. Okay. And in that room of people, we've got the doers. I like a good doer. However, with some of our doers, they isn't it funny how they just resist the word selling? They resist the word selling.
Well, I think a lot of the planet resists the word selling. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily just doers, but I mean, and here's the thing about it: like, all services firms start with a doer. I mean, unless you're independently wealthy and you just instantly start hiring people who will do the service. I mean, by definition, service firms start with a doer. It's one of the reasons they're easy to start, because if you're very good at something and you can get paid independently for doing it, well, you are now a services firm of a sort, right? But the thing that really trips people up with services firms, to quote a book I read a long time ago called The E-Myth Revisited, is there's a line in it. It's like all business books. Like, you could read the first chapter and not read anything else because you kind of have everything in it. But like, that first chapter had a quote in it that said, you need to stop working in your business. You need to start working on it. And that fundamental principle is where most small services firms get stuck, because, at the end of the day, you have to move from just delivering the services to actually selling net new services, marketing yourself, all the back office things, all that kind of stuff. And right in there, fairly quickly, you realize you got to figure out how to hire a salesperson. And the problem for most services firms is the idea of hiring somebody external to go do it, who doesn't have your domain knowledge, who doesn't have your expertise, who doesn't really understand your client base. That can be pretty scary, much less it's pretty expensive. So a lot of times a service firm will say, hey, Fred or Mary, you're really good at talking to clients. How about you find us some new ones? And right at that point, you try to take a doer and turn him into a seller. And there's definitely some gives and gets out of that process.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I was actually meeting with a client today, and part of their chain of sales is a kind of a first entry point of contact. And I'm going to leave the company out of this, but it's interesting that first chain of connection to the company, they're very naive. They are actually they're kind of underinformed in terms of the product, because they don't want them getting deeply into the product. So it's sort of a naive group that they want to sort of save that for the next stage of the selling process. So they intentionally have people who are a little bit lighter on the knowledge so they can actually force them to get into the questions they need to ask and not get tripped up by going too far down the line on a product that may not even be right for the customer. But I found it interesting that part of their process was to put people in who were not product matter.
Well, it's an
experts.
interesting point you raised, because one of the pitfalls with Doers is like in our business, right? So we're a market research firm. And we also do some marketing services. It's all for B2B technology companies. So if you're not a B2B technology company, don't even bother to visit the website. But if you are, like, if you're like a SaaS company, startup, et cetera, big tech company, feel free to check us out.
Well, give us that website real fast.
CascadeInsights.com.
Okay.
So, and basically though, the reason I bring it up on the research side is that one of the things that happens when you do research is you have to think about what the research methodology is going to be. Like, are we going to interview a bunch of people? Are we going to do focus groups? Are we going to do surveys, right? And what happens when you bring up somebody from the doer side over to the sales side is they will tend to spend an inordinate amount of time on kind of the guts of what they're delivering, right? It's like if you took a guy from Ford who built cars and you put him on the lot, he would open the hood. The first thing he would do is open the hood and be like, look how easy it is to change the oil on this, And meanwhile, everybody else is like, that's Jiffy Lube's job. Like, I don't do that. Like, can I just put it on the road? I want to know if it's fun to drive. Right. And the engineer's like, no, you don't understand how much engineering went into this oil pan, right? And you're like, and so that's the very first thing you have to work out of a doer. Now, on the other hand, it's a secret strength, because at some point particularly in B2B sales, eventually you will meet the client's version of the technocrat, right? They care very much about exactly what it is they're buying and how it plugs into whatever they have. And whether that's a systems thing or a process thing or one product plug. And then now that doer now has a superpower because, they actually engineered the car. So when you get farther enough down the line, they can actually answer those questions. But to your point, sometimes they can nerf a sale in the beginning because they're so far into the weeds of what the offering is. They're not actually dealing with the client's needs and whether they're even a fit. And so that's one thing you have to kind of work out of them in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I remember they're going to a safe spot, and product knowledge is typically for many a safe spot. So let's stay there. And it's almost a dirty trick because, I'm looking for the magic pill almost, but how do you take a doer and make them a seller? You give me a tip and I'll throw a tip back at you that I've used, but you're my guest. I want to hear you go first.
Well, I think the very first thing is initially just identification of which doers make sense. I mean, the simple reality is not all of your doers are going to become sellers because they're not very good communicators typically. I mean, in most services firms, once services start to be delivered, you don't always have a high emphasis on communication or interpersonal relationship skills, right? It's about getting the work done. It's about analyzing the contract. It's about doing the accounting. It's about painting the house. It's not necessarily about talking to the client. So the very first thing is, can they communicate effectively, verbally and written? And that's all the more so in, I would even say the written has become even more important with virtual selling, because I think of a story a client said to me once over the last year. They worked in some big tech company and they said, I didn't realize how dumb some of my colleagues were until I had to communicate with them only over email, because they just didn't know how to actually write any sentences, right? They were used to running into somebody's office and yabbering at them, and all of that went away. So I think you've got to first set a high bar for communication. And then I think you have to set a very high bar for empathy for the customer's needs. Because again, product people, delivery people can sometimes fall into the trap of like, I'm delivering quality, but defined by what I'm delivering, not by the reaction of the customer. So you have to have a lot of kind of good empathy building skills and ability to relate. And then I think the next biggest thing is you have to spend a massive amount of time apprenticing them. That's the thing that's a little bit different with doers versus bringing somebody in outside from the street. Now, there's plenty of positives to working with a doer versus an outside seller, and we could get into that. But I think it's about that like very progressive apprenticeship time where you're exposing them to individual pieces of the sales process one at a time and helping them figure out how to kind of relate to the customer in kind of the way they need to. And I would say the biggest tip is the one we initially talked about, which is getting them out of getting in the weeds of what the product knowledge is and talking about internally how they're going to buy it. And the last thing on that I'd say is super important is there's a book I read a long time ago called Buying Facilitation by a woman named Sharon Drew Morgan. And I don't even know what she's doing these days, but I read it in like the 90s. And it was probably the best book I've ever read about recognizing that in many cases, you're facilitating a buyer to buy, you're not making them buy. My impression of sales, growing up with a dad who sold small group health insurance and, very Glenn Glare, Glenn Ross, like everything was commission-based, had to close that week, whatever he sold, was everything was about making people buy. And I realized I really needed to figure out how to facilitate their buying. So all of those internal roadblocks and stakeholders and everything could kind of get out of the way. And I think if I was to put a fine point on it, I think the biggest problem with doers is they have the wrong impression of what sales is, because they never wanted the job to begin with. So you have to probably, and I probably put this at the top of the list because you got me thinking, it's probably the very, very first thing is educate them on what modern selling actually is and what goes into it. And then a lot of times they really light up about it.
Yeah.
So that plus the product knowledge are probably the two biggest things to work out in the beginning.
All right. Well, you're just terrible because you gave so many ideas there that clearly at some point you had to bump into one of Rob's ideas. But let me process what I heard a little bit. First of all, smart move. I'm such a sales trainer. It's like I'm ready to go tactic. And I appreciate the fact that the very first thing out of your mouth was, we got to make sure that we're getting the right person. So not every doer necessarily crosses over into sales. And as a 30-year sales trainer, you put them in front of me, I train them. I'm rarely in that process, but yes, I've walked into rooms where I've sort of thought, I'll do the best I can, but I'm teaching this person to play a sport, and there really is no athletic ability. So I can move them from a 2 to a 5, and you should be patting me on the back. Do we want a 5 out there? So I just want to repeat that so people get that. And I like the empathy piece as well, only because in sales, I am going to push a little bit and I'm going to get to the pain a little bit. And if I can't display empathy and do it, I don't want to be smiling while I'm asking you about the impact of one of the biggest losses that your company ever had. I have to develop that empathy. But I'll tell you, I'll swap an idea with you. I'll tell you something that I do that I find particularly valuable for those that don't really see themselves as salespeople. In sales, what are we trying to do? We're trying to figure out where the real objection is. I don't mind answering an objection, but I'm even happier if I can proactively get at it and not wait for cost or whatever it is at the end. I can nibble away at it. I think one of the issues with doers is that they're looking at Glenn Ross on TV, and they're looking at Jack Lemmon and Alec Baldwin, and they're going,
right. And who's going to get the steak knives and who's going to get fired, right? Exactly.
And I bought a car recently, and that wasn't me either. So sometimes what they're seeing really doesn't represent. And the objection I think that's out there is, I don't really possess the right personality for this. It's not that I can't learn it, but I bring up a person, see if you know this guy's name. I bring up a person named Ben Feldman. And Ben Feldman was I was an insurance guy too. And Ben Feldman was in the insurance industry. And when the number 2 person in the nation sold $50 million of insurance, and then 49 and 48, Feldman was selling 250, 260, 260 million. It was a machine. And everybody thought, well, we know what this guy looks like. He's Alec Baldwin. Okay. He's showing people his watch. Ben Feldman was 5'3", 5'4". He was kind of a large guy. He had hair like Larry on the Three Stooges. He spoke with a distinct pronounced lisp. He sold in East Liverpool, Ohio. And what we begin to get at is, he doesn't possess one attribute that you're associating with salespeople. But what he did was he dedicated himself to process, to empathy, to some of the things you're talking about, Sean. And what I'm doing before I get to here's how we sell is just diffusing this energy that is, I don't look like those people. I don't even
Well,
want to look like those people.
that's the thing. Like it's interesting. Sure, at the end of the day, if you can marry both, you might be really good. But at the same time, there's a couple things got me thinking about. One, sure, personable, being able to engage, all of that stuff's super important, right? But that can also lead you astray. Like a story, and then I want to come back to the process point because I think that's super important on a few levels. But like, one of the folks on my sales team, there's this great story. We were out on a sales trip together, all of us, and down in the Bay. And at this point, relatively junior seller had come up from the Doer side, very empathetic, very personable person on the team, right? Everybody would like to talk to this person. Well, at one point, it started during dinner, just talking about how clients just love their jokes and love their jokes and love their jokes. And I deadpanned for a minute. And I go, they might think they have to laugh. And there was this moment where it was just like, oh my God, you mean I'm not that funny? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, you there. And where I'm tying that in is you have to be very circumspect about how much your personality is driving the sale versus value. People do like to sell to people, buy from people they like. Yes, absolutely. But for any purchase that's more than marginal, you have to be delivering something of value. It has to be a good price point. They have to actually like your company as much as they like you. I mean, there's more than just put a shine on it and you just won them over. And to tie that back to the process thing, I think one of the things, if we're talking about this evolution for a minute about the smaller side, where you're going from like, owner maybe doing the selling or whatever, and now I'm going to bring up a doer, or maybe I decided to pull people from doer, is do your sellers actually follow any process that is documented at all? Or have you let them all be like kind of freewheeling superstars that they don't really follow any process? And what I found is, again, doers coming up from the product or the service side, they like process, they're used to process. That's how they deliver the services. So if you can take the time, even if you're more of an instinctive seller yourself, and say, okay, all right, what is the process I am following? Because all sales follows the process. It all does. Anybody who says like, well, I just go in there and I just, I do what I do. I'm a wizard, right? I'm like, no way. Yeah. You have a process that you follow. You may not be able to self-identify it, and you might need somebody to stand outside you and watch the steps you're taking. But even that Alec Baldwin kind of thing, right? There's still a process to everything. The watch is part of the process, right? It's a whole part of the thing. And I think sometimes people put this layer on selling that it's all about talent as opposed to the process. And I'm not discounting talent, but to your point, the guy from Ohio, he just had a really good process. He knew exactly how to make it churn. And here's the other thing that's super great about process. It's way less stressful to sell with a process than just on talent. Because I'll say something about my dad. My dad's been gone for a couple of years now, but love my dad to death. But he was a seller. And I know one of the things he struggled with, because he sold his whole life in a very high pressure side, is, and he would even say it occasionally, he'd be like, I always wondered if one day it would just be gone. And it was the talent. And yet I knew from watching my dad, he had a very detailed process that he went through for selling. But even himself, he had tricked himself in a way mentally over all those years to think it was some juice, that if he lost the juice, he wasn't going to be a seller. And it was like, looking back now at 51, I can look back at his career and my own career and be like, if he only had the solace of like, Dad, you had this great process. Yeah. You followed it all the time and it always worked for you. And the truth is, as long as you stayed on that railroad track, you were going to be like the guy in Ohio. And he also was the company's top seller year after year after year, over and over again. So anyway, so there's a lot I could agree with in what you said, a lot of different points.
Yeah. But you're also walking into something that I work on hard when I'm working with my clients, which is clearly there are people that we call, unconscious competence. They're naturals. Athletes, you'll find them very, just guys that can hit a baseball, that they don't want to think about it a lot. But it scares me when I run into unconscious competence like your dad, because if no one's ever backed them up and made them consciously competent, it's annoying. I guarantee you, he wouldn't have liked it. It's like surgery, but we're going to watch what you're doing. We're actually going to label it. but the problem is in sales, it's not if, but when you hit a slump and you don't know what it is that you're doing right, that's why people like your
Amen.
dad.
Amen. Exactly. And I coach my own sales team on that. I'm like, if there is, I've said it numerous times. I'm like, if this was a slow week, if we were following the process and we know the process works, things will be better next week. And if not next week, they'll be better. And of course, if they stay bad for long enough, well, now we're going to question the process, but we're not going to this is kind of a two-part thing, I guess I want to bring up. Like selling is psychologically insanely hard. It is. And it's why, and for listeners who never really quite knew this, it's why the sellers in your company are paid more than everybody else. If you want to know why, it's not because they have an ego bigger than yours. It's not because they negotiated better. It's because the job is crazy hard on you as a person. It is. And the way it gets better is if you can separate those two things. My dad honestly struggled with his whole life, even though he was insanely competent. And it's funny you bring this up, because one of the things when I brought my first doer over in the current company, I've had two companies, one I sold and then the current one. In my current company, that I co-own with another guy. We brought over our first doer from the sales team as we were growing again in this company. And I loved what this guy said. He said, I want to be your first instrumented seller. He said, I want to watch everything that you've done. And I want to follow that process and I want to document it. And I want to see how and I said, that's exactly what I want you to do. I want you to take everything that you see, and I'm going to work with you to document it. And now when we bring on a third and a fourth and a fifth seller, it's all there. There's a playbook they know how to follow. And the funny thing is, when we've had the opportunity to sometimes bring someone in from the outside, the interesting thing that happens is they instantly want to go around the process. There's a bit of them that wants to kind of say, can I just sell? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. I need you to do that, but I need you to actually learn the process first. So the street does work both ways. Your doers might actually be interested more in the process, and then you can't let the process trip them up. They still have to be human beings and part of the sales process. And when you bring somebody in from the outside, who's maybe not one of your doers, you have to latch their feet to the process for a while, because they're going to want to float away from it because they're just naturally talented. And you don't want to constrain that too much, but you do have to keep it all in mind. So I think it's one of the biggest lies in sales. It's a very process driven. I'll close with this on this point. Most great sellers are crazy organized, not in the traditional way, not in the Container Store sense. I go into the Container Store and I get hives. I just can't stand something that organized, right? I mean, it drives me crazy. But the way they go through their process, most exceptional sellers, it's very, very structured. And I think the fact that you're able to kind of work with companies and pull that out and stand outside them and figure that out, I think that's great.
Oof, you said a mouthful. And I'll just touch back on a few things. I like the rhythm of our conversation. I talk a little, you go, I want to get three things you just said there, Rob. But you threw out that, and I know I can hear people just wincing when you say you don't understand how hard it is to be in sales, because they do. They see, they're playing golf. They got a nice car. Nowhere, no profession do I know where you win and lose as often as you do in sales. You have to, I was on a panel in Europe recently, and they were asking about what's the most important thing you're looking for in a salesperson. And one person said, well, product knowledge. And I sort of grabbed my stomach. And another person said, because I always feel I can teach you product knowledge. It's hard to teach empathy, some of the things you're talking about, Sean. Another person said something similar. And I was kind of in a feisty mood. And I said, I'm looking for somebody who can take a punch, because that's what sales is. It's, what was it? Tyson who said, you don't know about, I'm not going to quote him perfectly, but basically you don't know a person, until they get hit in the face. And then, that's when you begin to understand.
Right.
So, and to add to that, I can tell you that sometimes when you see a salesperson have a great year and just nail it, what people don't realize is their reward is whatever trip they won, and a territory that's going to be cut significantly, and a target that's going to go up significantly. But they're going to move that finish line, which is a talk for another podcast, but it's the reality of sales. You just don't stay there. Okay, let me leave that one and get in another important point you made. And I'm curious about your feedback on this. I think one of the issues with selling is sort of what you meant is everybody's going in a different direction. So you got companies, and I'm going to brag about one of my companies, Xerox. When I sold for Xerox, I didn't like it, and then I loved it, which was it was a condition of employment to follow this process that we had been taught, and managers were coming into the field, and so you could be 250% a plan if you weren't following the process that we used. You were basically operating from a review standpoint at about a B minus, which basically allowed us to develop some consistency no matter who you meet with at Xerox. Two things you'll know. One, it's going to be more expensive than anything else you're looking at.
Right.
Two, the person's going to be well-trained. So implementation becomes critical. And then the last point, and I'll hand it back to you, is I think that you and I are process guys. I like that. I like something that's repeatable and predictable. I like making it my own. I didn't say the script. I just said a path that we can walk on. Trust, then urgency, then confirmation. Use your words, I'll use mine. I like that. But where salespeople wince, and I can imagine doers are going to wince, is you're putting me in a straitjacket. And people make decisions, not processes. I think one of the keys is we have to walk the walk from the training side of things to not just fall in love with role plays all the time that begin with every step and are graded based on how many steps you put in. It's not that I won't use a role play as part of the training, but eventually we have to play golf. We have to go out on the course and we're off the mats, which means I want my people to be able to defend the decisions they're making strategically and just show them and tell me I didn't use that close because I heard the client tell me they were committed to making a change.
Oh, right. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I mean, a couple things on that. Like one, yeah, I mean, I say all the time, sales is the ultimate meritocracy.
Yeah.
For better or worse. I mean, you can make, it is the only job I know of, like outside of like, being a billionaire who would have these kinds of options, I'm going to suggest, where like you can work 40 hours and do 3 times the productivity of someone else. Exactly like the guy you mentioned in Ohio. There aren't any jobs like that. Your average marketer can't like generate 4x the output of somebody else usually in 40 hours, right? Your average billable consultant can't do 4 times the amount of billables. There's only so many hours in a day. Right. But sales, you can have people that are producing 4, 5, 6, 7x somebody else. And so it's a challenging thing from that standpoint. I think a good point you raised about scripts. We're talking about process here. We don't have sales scripts. We might have sales paragraphs.
Right.
We might have sales bullet points, and we have lots of those. Like, hey, this is a phrase that really works. I'll give you one from our side, right? Like we say clients come to us for pain or opportunity. Pain drives most of their reason to go call a research firm, and opportunity drives less because pain carries farther. And okay, almost everybody here says that. And the reason they say it is because it does box in pretty well why people come to us.
Right.
There is not a fixed close statement around here that everybody uses. There's not because otherwise they're not listening to your point. They're not listening how to morph it back. And that's actually, to take us to a slightly different place, that's talk about things doers need to be trained. I tend to say clients say something and then there's something in parenthetical that they didn't say. There's always the unstated thing. And what I find a lot of times with doers is doers are good because they follow a process, they've done the project, they know how to do whatever that service delivery is, which usually has some kind of boundaries to it. And so they're used to kind of client asks a question, they answer it. Client asks a question, they answer it. And what sometimes they have to break out is say, wait a minute, why that question? Is there a question behind the question, or is there a question behind the question that's behind the question, right? And training them to notice those moments, I find is like, you have to do it by apprenticing them. There isn't really a great way to role play that 100%, but like if you apprentice them and take them on enough sales calls where they go, oh, I get it. When they ask that, they're really asking this. And so I need to jump to this part of the conversation because that's really what they're driving at, right? And it's basically in a weird way, you could almost say the way a doer likes to deal with the conversation is actually probably more polite. I mean, who doesn't want to have the question they ask be answered, right? I mean, that's probably a better way to be a human being, I guess. But like at the end of the day, your goal in sales is to really help that organization achieve its objective. And sometimes the person you're talking to isn't necessarily asking you the right questions to do that. And so you have to find a way to figure out what's driving it from behind it. And that's a very abstract kind of exercise. And so I find that's a really big thing to figure out. Can somebody sit on a call, this doer you're bringing over, and can they listen to the conversation and kind of see what music is playing in the background, right? And actually then react to it. And honestly, you might find some people can't do that well. Yeah. And maybe they're going to be less performing sellers, or maybe they're just going to be better at performing the process. But, outside of some of the other attributes to look for, I would say that would be a really big one. Can they listen to a sentence and realize something was in parenthetical that wasn't actually stated out loud? And that's the thing they need to ask the question about, right, in response.
Oh, well, I agree with you completely. I actually think, I'll say it slightly differently. I think that the biggest challenge the salespeople have is not the question. You can write out any question you want going in there. It's the 2 or 3 you're chasing after that question. And there was some years.
Right. The follow up wins most of the stuff. Right. It's the follow up question that is insightful or challenging or whatever.
That's the question.
Right? That's the one where they go, wait a minute, nobody asked me that. Right. And to your point, it's not knowledge. You didn't say something. You asked a question that created churn and momentum in their brain. And that's what they remember you for.
Right. Not only will they remember you for that, but if you want to create change, it's probably going to be not that initial question about whatever pain point, or, it's interesting to use those two terms. I call it consequence or value. We're speaking the same language again, but it's not that issue that you're dealing with. It's 3 levels deeper that you really haven't been asked or lived through yet. And that's really where the sale or the leverage is going to come from. What I was going to tell you was I tried to put a course together one time on improv, actually teaching salespeople improv skills. And I see you nodding your head because, they really are you have to learn how to improv. You can give me any process you want. I'm still going to have to, I have to come up with questions based on what I'm hearing. Anyway, couldn't draw flies. It's a great lesson in marketing. I changed the program to mental agility, teaching people to be more mentally, bang, filling up butts in the seats. So everybody was coming. I didn't change. I searched the document, took out the word improv. I think people thought I was going to have
rename it, and all of a sudden everybody's there. Yeah, no, mental agility for that audience probably makes a lot more sense.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Particularly an older audience. All right. Last question, and then I'll let you go. Give me 1 or 2 lessons that you've learned somewhere along the line that for you personally had the biggest impact on your career or even your life.
Well, I'll give you one sales story, and I'll give you one more personal story just as an owner. So I would say from a sales standpoint, I remember, and this is a fairly tactical thing, but I think it ties in really well in what we talked about. I was selling this guy who was a vice president at HP, super excited that I got into the meeting. I started spitting out all the cool things that we could do, that we could legitimately do, very product knowledge-y. And the guy held up his hand, which is never a good sign. And he looked at me and he said, I know you want to keep the aperture wide open, but what's the one thing I should hire you for? And there's so many things that basically at that point I lost. On the other hand, I did actually win the guy. We did actually do work with Paul Logue and carried on a good relationship, but don't leave the aperture wide open is a huge one. Can I give you 2 more? They're both fast. I'll make them quick. So
yes, it's because you're interesting. Keep going.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. So another one this was when I was younger. So I was working. So the restaurant I met my wife was a Signature Room restaurant at the top of the Hancock building in Chicago, 95th floor. I'd worked my way through restaurants up to that point, was getting my master's degree. She comes in as a patron. The rest is history on that. But while I was there, I was super excited about the money we were making, because this was a really high-end restaurant. In the mid 90s, I was making like $150 a night as a starving college student, right? Which, just do the math on inflation after the show for anybody listening and what that really was. And so this 5'1" fire plug of an expediter, the guys that bring out the food that was on the waiter team. I'm counting the money. I've been there about a week, and I'm the back waiter holding all the money for the team and the tips. And I'm like, wow, this is just a crazy amount of money. He walks up to me, slaps his hand down that was like the size of my head, and slaps it on the table. And he says, "Don't count the chickens." And I really ran away screaming. And so to this day, when my sales team, I always tell them the story whenever they come on. And so whenever they start getting a little uppy about like, we're going to get all this, I'm like, "Don't count the chickens." And so like, and he thought it was like bad juice to basically count it before the end of the night was the idea, right? Because you didn't really know what it was going to be. And it was a great lesson. I never counted the money until the end of the night, kind of terrified of this guy. And so the last thing is, and I say this more for business owners, like my first business, I was too identified with the business. It went up, I went down. I went up, it went down, I went down. And I think salespeople could relate to this too. And I know my dad struggled with it his whole life. I would just say it's faith to me. I did not have a strong faith in my first business. I had kind of a distant faith with Christianity. And by the time I got my second business, it was extremely, well, I don't think you ever used the words extremely and mature in the same sense, but it was more mature. And it's given me the psychological separation that if this business goes up or down, it doesn't mean I go up or down. And I would just say that having a focus of faith outside of your own abilities when you're in sales or when you're as a business owner is super crucial to just having not just good mental health, but just having a good life. And I would just think that's a super important thing for everybody to think about. And that's probably the biggest lesson I've learned over the last 21 years. So,
okay. All right. Well, I got a bonus one. I leave faith for those who, have that calling. I trade that in. Sometimes I tell them, just remind yourself of your track record. What usually happens in these situations? I'm writing a piece right now. I'm calling it the what ifs. I think a lot of us struggle with beginning to, well, what if this happens? What if I can't do this? What if, sort of what you were describing.
Right.
Yeah, I don't
and
like
takes us back to
what ifs.
Yep. Yeah. And it takes us back to the process. Are you following the process, or do you know what the process is? Are you able to kind of like see if you're off track, and then rest easy on that Friday night when you didn't close a lot of deals that week, and wake up Monday ready to hit it?
Yeah. Well, Sean, it's been a delight. I'm giving us both an A on Pep Talk and a C on Pocket Size, because we got a lot of information in this one. But that's the beauty of meeting a person like you. And just, sometimes people ask me, how long will the podcast go? And I don't quite put it in these words, but what I'm really channeling is, as long as you're interesting, that's how we'll go. I could go a whole nother segment with you. You got a lot of really great information. How do people get a hold of you?
You can reach out to me at Sean, SEAN at cascadeinsights.com, and do that for one of two reasons. Like, either you want to learn more about what we offer because you're the right fit, and you can check that out at cascadeinsights.com. Or if you just want to talk to somebody who's been doing it for a while and you just want to compare notes on how can I get some doers, how can I grow my sales team, I'm always happy to do that. That's not a remuneration thing. That's just a pay it forward thing. So if you got questions about how to make it work, just in general as a business owner or a sales team leader, just let me know.
Perfect. And if you need a reason, play the podcast back. I don't think you understand why. You're probably going to want to contact my man, Sean, here. Sean, I'm grateful that you gave us the opportunity to talk today. And thank you so much for being a guest.
Thanks for having me on, man.
Good. Well, we'll do it again as well as we can next time. Until then, everybody, stay safe.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please rate and recommend it on iTunes, Outcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information on this show and Rob at jollis.com.